Syracuse, New York, February 1992. A city in central New York where winter arrived brutally with lake-effect snow that buried streets under feet of accumulation, where temperatures dropped below zero at night, and where people moved quickly between heated buildings and children were taught never to stay outside longer than necessary. The Palmer family lived on James Street in a modest two-story house, and Alan worked as a high school history teacher, while Veronica was a nurse at Upstate University Hospital working evening shifts, and they had two daughters, Cassidy, who was 11, and Jenna, who was 8. Cassidy had straight black hair cut to shoulder length, deep brown eyes, tan skin inherited from her mother's Puerto Rican heritage, and a serious, focused personality that made her seem older than 11, and she rarely smiled, was intensely competitive, and dedicated herself completely to gymnastics. She trained at Syracuse Gymnastics Academy 6 days a week, and her coach Greg Hoffman believed she had Olympic potential, and Cassidy dreamed of competing at the highest levels, and she accepted the grueling schedule and physical pain as necessary sacrifices for greatness. On Thursday, February 13, 1992, Cassidy had practice from 6 to 8 in the evening, and Veronica was working a 12-hour hospital shift, and Alan was supposed to pick Cassidy up at 8, but his car would not start in the freezing temperature, and he called the gym asking if someone could give Cassidy a ride home. Coach Hoffman said most parents had already left, but there was a city bus stop directly in front of the gym, and the Route 24 bus ran every 30 minutes, and it would take Cassidy within 2 blocks of her house, and Alan reluctantly agreed, and he said he would meet her at the bus stop near their house. Practice ended at 8 o'clock, and Cassidy changed from her leotard into gray sweatpants and a purple puffer jacket, and she packed her gym bag, which was bright green nylon with her name, Cassidy, embroidered on the side in yellow thread, and she walked out into the freezing night alone. The temperature was 7 degrees Fahrenheit with wind chill making it feel like -10, and snow was falling steadily, and the bus stop was directly in front of the gym under a streetlight, and Cassidy stood there holding her green gym bag, breath visible in the cold air. Coach Hoffman watched from the gym window as Cassidy waited, and he saw her check her watch, and she was the last student to leave, and other coaches had already gone home, and Hoffman locked up the gym around 8:15 and walked to his car in the parking lot. He later told police he had seen Cassidy still waiting at the bus stop when he left, and he had asked if she was okay, and she had said her father was meeting her at the stop near home, and Hoffman had driven away heading north on Salina Street, and that was the last confirmed sighting of Cassidy Palmer alive. The Route 24 bus arrived at the stop at 8:22 according to the driver's log, but when the bus pulled up, no one was waiting, and the driver thought nothing of it, assumed the person had gotten a ride or gone inside, and the bus continued its route. Alan arrived at the bus stop near their house on James Street at 8:30, and Cassidy was not there, and he waited 15 minutes thinking maybe she had missed the 8:30 bus and would catch the 9 o'clock, but she never appeared, and Alan drove to the gym. The gym was dark and locked, and Alan saw the bus stop in front was empty, and panic began rising as he realized Cassidy had disappeared somewhere between the gym and home, and he drove the bus route checking every stop, calling her name, but found nothing. If this happened in your neighborhood, wouldn't you want to know how it was finally solved? Tell us in the comments what city or country you're watching from. It's incredible to see how far these stories travel, and if you'd like to follow more mysteries finally solved through DNA, consider subscribing to the DNA archives where every day we uncover another truth time tried to hide. He called the Syracuse Police Department at 9:15 reporting his 11-year-old daughter missing, and officers responded immediately, and Detective Frank Moretti took lead on the case, and he was 48 years old with 26 years of experience, and he understood that a child missing in 7-degree weather was critical. Moretti interviewed Alan asking when Cassidy was last seen, what she was wearing, where she should have been, and Alan described the purple puffer jacket, the gray sweatpants, the white sneakers, the green gym bag with her name on it, and he explained about the bus stop and the failed car. Officers immediately went to the bus stop in front of Syracuse Gymnastics Academy, and they found nothing. No gym bag, no sign of struggle, just footprints in the snow that were already being covered by falling flakes, and the area was deserted and dark. Moretti interviewed the Route 24 bus driver, who confirmed he had stopped at that location at 8:22, and no one had been waiting, and Moretti realized that meant Cassidy had disappeared in the 7 minutes between Hoffman leaving at 8:15 and the bus arriving at 8:22. Coach Hoffman was interviewed at his home, and he said he had seen Cassidy waiting when he locked up, had asked if she was okay, and she had said yes, and he had driven away, and he seemed concerned and cooperative, and Moretti had no reason to suspect him. Search parties formed immediately with volunteers and police searching the route between the gym and the Palmer house, checking alleys and parking lots and buildings, and they searched through the night despite the freezing temperature and falling snow, and they found no trace of Cassidy. The case dominated Syracuse news the next morning with Cassidy's school photo, showing her serious expression and dark hair appearing on television, and the story of a child vanishing from a bus stop in freezing weather shocked the community where parents felt gymnastics practice was safe. Veronica came home from her hospital shift at 7 in the morning to find Alan and police officers in her house, and when she learned Cassidy was missing, she screamed and collapsed, and Jenna, who was 8, watched terrified as her mother was helped to the couch, and the little girl understood something terrible had happened to her sister. Detective Moretti organized systematic searches of the area around the gym and along the bus route, and with temperatures still below freezing and snow accumulating, he feared Cassidy could not survive long outside, and he requested helicopters with thermal imaging to search for any heat signature. The thermal search found nothing, and dive teams checked nearby Onondaga Creek despite it being partially frozen, and they found no evidence Cassidy had fallen through ice. And Moretti began to suspect this was not a case of a child getting lost, but rather an abduction. He interviewed everyone who had been at the gym that evening, and 12 students had attended practice along with Coach Hoffman and 2 assistant coaches, and all the students had left with parents between 7:45 and 8 o'clock, and Cassidy had been the last one there. The assistant coaches had left at 7:50 after cleaning equipment, and they said Coach Hoffman had been alone with Cassidy for the final 10 minutes of practice, and this was normal because Hoffman often gave advanced students extra attention, and no one had thought anything was wrong. Moretti interviewed Hoffman more extensively, asking about those final 10 minutes alone with Cassidy, and Hoffman said he had been working with her on her floor routine, giving her corrections, and she had changed and left around 8, and he had locked up shortly after. Hoffman agreed to a polygraph test and the results were inconclusive. The examiner said Hoffman showed stress responses, but they could be explained by being questioned about a missing student, and without physical evidence, Moretti could not determine if Hoffman was hiding something. Officers searched the gym thoroughly with Hoffman's permission, and they found nothing suspicious, no blood, no signs of struggle, no evidence that Cassidy had been harmed there, and Hoffman's car was also searched and came back clean. The investigation expanded to check known sex offenders within a 20-mile radius of Syracuse, and Moretti interviewed dozens of individuals, but all had alibis for the evening of February 13th, and none had been near the gym or the bus route. Weeks turned into months with massive searches as snow melted in spring, revealing parks and wooded areas that had been inaccessible in winter, but no trace of Cassidy was found. Not her purple jacket, not her green gym bag, nothing. The case went cold by summer of 1992, with Coach Hoffman remaining a person of interest but with no evidence to pursue charges, and the Palmer family was left with devastating uncertainty and the terrible suspicion that someone connected to the gym knew what had happened. Cold cases don't stay alive unless people keep remembering them, so if you want more stories like this, cases that seemed forgotten until DNA brought answers, subscribe to the DNA archives and help these stories stay alive. New investigations and discoveries are shared here every day. Veronica and Alan's marriage deteriorated under the weight of grief and blame, and they divorced in 1994. And Veronica kept the house on James Street while Alan moved to an apartment, and both struggled to function while not knowing if Cassidy was alive or dead. Jenna grew up in the shadow of her missing sister, and she remembered Cassidy as serious and driven, remembered feeling like she could never measure up to her talented older sister. And after Cassidy disappeared, Jenna carried guilt that she had sometimes resented Cassidy's perfection. She also carried fear that had shaped her entire childhood, fear of being outside alone, fear of bus stops and dark parking lots, and she developed anxiety that required therapy throughout her teenage years, and she never participated in sports because gymnastics gyms reminded her of loss. Syracuse Gymnastics Academy continued operating, and Coach Hoffman remained head coach until he retired in 2015, and he maintained his innocence and said Cassidy's disappearance haunted him, and he had cooperated with every investigation, and parents continued to trust him with their children. Years passed, and Cassidy's case became one of New York's most haunting unsolved missing children cases, and her face appeared on age progression posters showing what she might look like at 20, at 30, at 40, but no credible sightings ever materialized. Detective Moretti retired in 2012 after 46 years in law enforcement, and Cassidy's case remained unsolved. The girl who vanished from a bus stop on a freezing night, and he died in 2018, still believing the answer lay with someone at that gym. Veronica died in 2019 from breast cancer at age 65, and she died never knowing what happened to Cassidy, never getting to bury her daughter, and her last words to Jenna were asking her to keep searching, to never stop looking. Alan remained in Syracuse living alone, and he kept Cassidy's room in storage with her trophies and medals and gymnastics photos, and he volunteered with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and he never remarried because he said part of him died the night Cassidy disappeared. In October 2024, 32 years after Cassidy vanished, construction workers breaking ground for a new apartment complex on the outskirts of Syracuse unearthed something buried 3 feet underground, a deteriorated green nylon bag with faded yellow embroidery that spelled Cassidy. The construction was halted immediately, and Syracuse police were called, and the area was secured as a potential crime scene, and Detective Sarah Chen, who now handled cold cases, was notified, and she responded with a forensic team. Excavation continued carefully under Chen's supervision, and beneath the gym bag they found fabric, the remains of a purple puffer jacket, and beneath that were bones, small and delicate, a child's skeleton that had been buried for 3 decades. The remains were transported to the Onondaga County Medical Examiner's office, and forensic analysis confirmed through dental records that they belonged to Cassidy Palmer, and she had been buried there since 1992, less than 5 miles from where she had disappeared from the bus stop. Detective Chen called Jenna Palmer, who was now 40 years old and living in Rochester, and she told her that Cassidy had been found, that she was dead, and Jenna collapsed crying. 32 years of not knowing replaced by terrible certainty, and she called her father Alan immediately. Alan drove to the construction site and stood at the edge of the excavation area, staring at the place where his daughter had been buried for 3 decades, and he was 72 years old now, and he had spent more than half his life wondering what happened to Cassidy. The green gym bag was sent to the New York State Crime Lab for DNA analysis, and Chen requested they test every surface, particularly the handles and zipper, and the lab found Cassidy's DNA as expected, but they also found male DNA on the handles and shoulder strap. The pattern and concentration of the male DNA suggested someone had carried the bag, had gripped the handles tightly, and Chen ran the unknown profile through CODIS hoping for a match, and after 2 weeks the system returned a result that made her heart race. The DNA belonged to Greg Hoffman, who was now 74 years old and living in Syracuse, and Chen pulled his records, discovering he had been arrested in 2016 for assault after an altercation at a bar, and his DNA had been entered into the database as part of his booking. Chen began investigating the construction site where Cassidy had been found, and she discovered that in 1992, the land had been vacant, owned by a development company, and it was located directly behind a storage facility that Greg Hoffman had rented from 1990 to 1995. She obtained warrants for Hoffman's current residence and to bring him in for questioning, and on a cold morning in November 2024, she and 4 other officers executed the warrant at Hoffman's home on the north side of Syracuse. Hoffman answered the door in a bathrobe, and when Chen showed her badge and said they needed to talk about Cassidy Palmer, his face went completely white, and he asked if he needed a lawyer, and Chen said that was his right, but they were searching his home regardless. Officers searched systematically, and in Hoffman's basement they found boxes of old gymnastics equipment and photographs, and among them were dozens of photos of Cassidy, more than seemed normal for a coach to keep. Images of her training, competing, practicing, documenting her progress obsessively. They also found a journal Hoffman had kept, and reading it, Chen discovered entries from February 1992 describing his frustration that Cassidy was planning to switch gyms, that another coach had been recruiting her, and that Hoffman felt betrayed after investing years in developing her talent. Chen arrested Hoffman and transported him to the Syracuse Police Department, and after reading him his rights, he initially refused to speak, but after sitting in the interrogation room for 3 hours, he said he wanted to make a statement, that he had carried guilt for 32 years. Chen activated the recording equipment and asked Hoffman to explain what happened to Cassidy Palmer on February 13, 1992, and Hoffman sat silent for several minutes before speaking, his voice shaking and barely audible. He said after practice ended at 8 o'clock and the other students left, he had confronted Cassidy about her plans to leave his gym, and Cassidy had confirmed she was switching to a facility in Liverpool that specialized in Olympic-level training, and Hoffman had become angry. He said they had argued, and he had grabbed her shoulder trying to make her understand how much he had sacrificed for her training, and Cassidy had pulled away and said she did not owe him anything, that her parents were making the decision, and Hoffman had grabbed her harder. Cassidy had struggled and pushed him, and in his rage Hoffman had pushed her back and she had fallen hitting her head on the corner of the balance beam, and when he checked on her she was unconscious and not breathing, and he realized with horror that he had killed her. 20 years later, one overlooked fragment changed everything, and that's what we explore here. The moment science meets persistence. So if you're new here, subscribe so you don't miss the next story where DNA finally tells the truth. A new case drops every day on the DNA archives. Hoffman said he panicked completely. He checked for a pulse but found nothing, and he realized his career and his life were over, and instead of calling for help, he made the terrible decision to hide what he had done. He had wrapped Cassidy's body in a tarp from the equipment room, and he had loaded her and her gym bag into his car, and he had driven to the vacant land behind his storage unit, and he had buried her there using a shovel he kept in his storage locker. He had returned to the gym and cleaned the area where Cassidy had fallen, and he had driven to the bus stop and waited, and when the Route 24 bus had come and gone without stopping, he had driven home, and when police questioned him the next day he had lied, saying he had seen Cassidy waiting and had left. Detective Chen listened to Hoffman's confession with disgust. He had killed an 11-year-old girl in a fit of rage and ego because she wanted to pursue better training, and he had buried her and let her family suffer for 32 years while he continued coaching children. She asked Hoffman why he had not called for help immediately, and Hoffman said he panicked, that he knew even an accident would end his career and possibly result in charges, and he had prioritized protecting himself over doing the right thing, and he acknowledged this decision had compounded the tragedy. Chen asked if he had ever considered confessing over the decades, and Hoffman said yes, constantly. The guilt had consumed him. He had nightmares about Cassidy. He had become an alcoholic trying to numb the memories, and his 2016 assault arrest had been a drunken bar fight, triggered by someone mentioning gymnastics. The confession was devastating for Alan and Jenna Palmer, learning that Coach Hoffman, the man they had trusted with Cassidy's training and safety, had killed her and hidden her body while pretending to help search, while attending vigils, while maintaining his position coaching other children. Jenna was particularly haunted by the realization that she had attended the same gym after Cassidy disappeared, that her parents had kept her enrolled there thinking it was safe, and she had trained under Hoffman's supervision for 2 more years, and he had smiled at her and acted concerned while knowing he had buried her sister. The community of Syracuse was shocked and outraged, and parents whose children had trained under Hoffman felt violated and betrayed, and many came forward saying they had always felt something was off about his intensity and possessiveness with talented students, but had dismissed it as dedication. Hoffman was charged with second-degree manslaughter, evidence tampering, and making false statements to law enforcement, and his public defender reviewed the confession and the DNA evidence and advised him that fighting the charges was pointless given the overwhelming proof. In January 2025, Hoffman entered a guilty plea to all charges, and at his sentencing hearing, Alan and Jenna both gave victim impact statements, and Alan told the court that Hoffman had not only killed Cassidy, but had tortured her family for 32 years with lies. He said Hoffman had stood at vigils and memorial services, had hugged Veronica while she cried, had told them he hoped Cassidy would be found safe, all while knowing exactly where she was, and that level of deception was unforgivable, and he hoped Hoffman would suffer for what he had done. Jenna spoke about the guilt she had carried for decades, about the fear and anxiety that had shaped her life, about her mother dying without ever knowing what happened, and she said Hoffman had stolen not just Cassidy, but the family's peace and sense of safety. Hoffman was given an opportunity to speak, and he stood before the judge crying and said he was sorry, that he had made a terrible mistake in a moment of anger and had compounded it by covering up the truth, and he said no apology could return the years he had stolen. The judge sentenced Hoffman to 15 years for manslaughter, 5 years for evidence tampering, and 5 years for false statements, to be served consecutively for a total of 25 years. And Hoffman was 74, and this was effectively a life sentence. As he was led away in handcuffs, he looked at Alan and Jenna one final time and mouthed, "I'm sorry," and Alan turned away, refusing to acknowledge him, and Jenna stared at him with an expression of pure hatred, and Hoffman disappeared into the prison system. The funeral for Cassidy was held in February 2025, 33 years after she disappeared, at the same church where her family had held memorial services over the decades, and the sanctuary was full of people who had searched for her and never forgotten. The casket was small and white, covered in purple flowers to match the jacket she had been wearing, and inside beside her remains was her green gym bag that had preserved the DNA evidence, and Alan placed her gymnastics medals in the casket, saying she had earned them even if she never got to display them. Jenna delivered a eulogy talking about Cassidy's dedication and discipline, about how she had been the serious, focused sister while Jenna had been the playful one, and she said Hoffman had stolen Cassidy's Olympic dreams and their family's future, and his 25-year sentence was not nearly enough. Alan could not speak at the service. His grief was too overwhelming, but he had written a statement that the pastor read, thanking everyone who had searched, who had kept Cassidy's case active, and expressing devastation that Veronica had died without getting to bury their daughter. Cassidy was buried at Oakwood Cemetery on a hillside overlooking the city, and her headstone read, "Cassidy Maria Palmer, forever 11, beloved daughter and sister, our gymnast, finally home," and the grave was covered with flowers, gymnastics ribbons, and stuffed animals. Alan visited the grave daily, and he would sit on the bench nearby talking to Cassidy about what she had missed, about the Olympics she would have competed in, about the life Hoffman had stolen, and he found some peace in finally being able to visit a physical place where his daughter rested. Jenna struggled with complicated emotions in the months following the funeral, and therapy helped her process the rage at Hoffman, the grief for Cassidy, the guilt about her mother dying without answers, and the relief that the uncertainty was finally over, even though the truth was devastating. She established a foundation in 2025 called the Cassidy Palmer Athletic Safety Initiative, dedicated to implementing oversight and safety protocols at youth sports programs, requiring multiple coaches present during practices, and creating reporting systems for concerning behavior. The foundation also advocated for background checks and psychological evaluations for youth coaches, for security cameras in training facilities, and for teaching young athletes about recognizing and reporting inappropriate behavior from authority figures. The months following Hoffman's sentencing were filled with revelations as other former gymnasts came forward with stories about his controlling behavior, his inappropriate comments about their bodies, his rage when students left his program, and many said they had been afraid of him but had not reported it. The New York State Athletic Commission launched an investigation into Syracuse Gymnastics Academy and similar facilities, and they discovered that oversight of youth sports programs was minimal, that coaches were not required to undergo psychological evaluations, and that reporting systems for abuse were inadequate. New regulations were implemented requiring security cameras in all training areas, mandatory breaks for athletes, and the presence of multiple staff members during practices, and these changes became known informally as Cassidy's Law, though they were never formally codified under that name. Jenna became a spokesperson for athletic safety reform despite her discomfort with attention, and she spoke at conferences about the dangers of coaches who viewed athletes as property, about the importance of teaching children to question authority when something felt wrong, and about the lifelong impact of violence hidden behind mentorship. She emphasized that Hoffman had not been a predatory pedophile in the traditional sense, but rather someone whose ego and possessiveness had led to violence, and that this type of danger was harder to identify because it masqueraded as dedication and high standards. The documentary about Cassidy's case was released in 2026 titled The Coach Who Knew, The Cassidy Palmer Story, and it detailed Hoffman's obsession with talented students, the night he killed Cassidy in rage over her leaving, and the 32 years he had maintained the lie. The documentary sparked conversations about power dynamics in youth sports, about how talented young athletes are vulnerable to controlling coaches, about the importance of allowing children autonomy over their athletic careers, and about recognizing warning signs of possessive behavior from authority figures. Allen died peacefully in his sleep in August 2027 at age 75, and he had lived to see Hoffman convicted and Cassidy buried, and his final years had been spent advocating for athletic safety reforms, and he died knowing his daughter's case had created change. He was buried beside Cassidy at Oakwood Cemetery, and Jenna spoke at his funeral about his decades of searching, his refusal to give up hope, his grace in forgiving himself for the car that would not start on that freezing February night, and his legacy of protecting other children through advocacy. Jenna continued her work with the foundation, and she expanded its mission to include supporting families of children killed by coaches or authority figures, recognizing that this specific type of betrayal created unique trauma that required specialized counseling and support. She also began working with gymnastics programs to implement better communication systems between coaches and parents, to encourage transparency about training methods, and to create pathways for athletes to change coaches without fear of retaliation or blacklisting. The green gym bag that had preserved Hoffman's DNA was eventually donated to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children as an educational tool, demonstrating how objects buried for decades could still yield evidence if properly excavated and tested. Greg Hoffman remained in prison at Attica Correctional Facility, and he did not appeal his sentence, and he worked in the prison library organizing books, and other inmates knew what he had done, and he existed in isolation serving his time without visitors or letters. He died in prison in 2031 from complications of diabetes at age 81, and there was no funeral, no service, no public acknowledgement beyond a notation in prison records, and his ashes were disposed of according to state protocol. Jenna felt conflicted about his death, relief that he could no longer benefit from appeals or early release mixed with frustration that he had escaped serving his full sentence, and her therapist helped her process the reality that some forms of justice would always feel incomplete. The construction site where Cassidy had been found was eventually developed into affordable housing, and the developers installed a small memorial garden on the property with a plaque reading, "In memory of Cassidy Palmer, 1980-1992, may her story protect others," and residents maintained the garden carefully. Syracuse Gymnastics Academy closed permanently in 2028, the reputation destroyed by Hoffman's conviction, and the building was converted into a community center offering after-school programs with strict safety protocols and oversight, and Cassidy's photograph was displayed in the lobby. The story reminds us that time doesn't erase truth, it only delays it. And if stories like this move you, if you want to see more forgotten cases finally solved through DNA and advancing technology, subscribe to the DNA Archives where new stories are shared every day. It's free and it helps these stories reach more people who still believe in justice after decades of silence. And it reminds us that predators hide behind positions of authority and trust, that coaches can become dangerously possessive, and that young athletes deserve protection not just from strangers but from those claiming to develop their potential. Cassidy Palmer was 11 years old when she vanished from a freezing bus stop in Syracuse after gymnastics practice, killed by her coach in a rage because she wanted better training, and buried for 32 years while he continued coaching other children and pretending to care about her disappearance. Not as a tragedy alone but as a catalyst for reforming youth sports oversight, as proof that DNA evidence survives decades of burial, as inspiration for believing that construction and development can uncover long-hidden crimes, and as validation that even accidental killings covered up with lies deserve full prosecution. Her green gym bag with yellow embroidery preserved the DNA that exposed her killer, and that bag waited 32 years underground until construction workers unearthed it. And in the end, the truth emerged not through investigation, but through chance discovery, proving that some secrets stay buried only until someone digs deep enough, and that justice delayed is painful but still necessary, and that some coaches care more about their egos than the children they claim to mentor, and protecting young athletes requires vigilance from parents, transparency from programs, and courage from children to speak when something feels wrong.